The lights in the Galactic Games arena shimmered like distant stars, stretching far beyond what any human could ever hope to see. A dazzling spectacle of alien architecture, glistening metal, and holographic projections filled every inch of the colossal structure. Its energy thrummed through the very air, electrifying, overwhelming, and intimidating to the Earth's representative. Standing at the edge of the arena, Eli Jansen could feel the hum of the games reverberating in his chest like a heartbeat from another world. The stares from alien spectators were sharp enough to slice through steel. Eli had expected the spectacle, but the scale of it still took his breath away. Massive holograms of strange, powerful creatures, an infinite array of species and galaxies, flickered across the arena's walls. From his position just beyond the gates, he could hear the rumble of distant cheers, the sound of millions of beings from across the galaxy, all waiting for the competition to begin. The scent of ozone mixed with something unfamiliar, sharp and sweet, like 1,000 alien flowers blooming in the distance, filling the air. The temperature was controlled, but the tension in the atmosphere was thick enough to suffocate anyone unprepared. "First time in the games, Earthling?" A deep voice broke through his thoughts. Eli turned to see Zara Kellen, his former coach and the only one who still believed in his potential. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes, still sharp as ever, scanned the arena with a mix of excitement and apprehension. She had been instrumental in his training, but even she could feel the weight of the galaxy's eyes upon them. "First time seeing something like this, for sure." Eli's voice was calm, too calm considering the circumstances. He had seen pressure before, but this was unlike anything else. He could practically hear the soft click of 100 alien species calculating his chances. Humans weren't expected to win, not in this competition. He was just a symbol, an experiment to prove the inclusion of Earth was nothing but a joke. Zara's hand rested on his shoulder, steady and grounding. "Don't let the size of the crowd or the weight of their gaze get to you. You've done the hardest part already." She wasn't wrong. For Eli, the hardest part wasn't the competition, but the pressure to prove humanity's worth in a galaxy that had long viewed them as insignificant. The games were designed to showcase the best and brightest of every species, beings far stronger, faster, and more durable than a human. Earth had no place here, but the Council had chosen him. Why? Perhaps they had hoped to impress the galaxy with Earth's participation, or maybe they simply wanted to prove that humans were capable of more than just surviving. Eli had been retired for years after a career-ending injury, but the one thing he still had was a sharp mind and the will to compete. He had never stopped training, never stopped believing in his ability to come back and prove that Earth could rise to the challenge. "All right," Zara said, breaking him from his thoughts. "Let's get you into position. Your event is up next." Her voice carried an undercurrent of pride. "You've got this." Eli nodded and adjusted the straps on his athletic suit, a uniform designed by the galaxy's best engineers, tailored for the extreme conditions of the games. The fabric was soft yet firm against his skin, enhancing his mobility without restricting movement. It was a perfect fit. He just wished his mind felt as controlled. The warm-up area was a bustling hub of activity, filled with participants from all corners of the galaxy. Eli couldn't help but notice the sheer variety of beings around him, some of them towering over him with muscle and strength, their alien features incomprehensible to the human eye. Others floated, their bodies suspended in midair as they adjusted to gravity. There were species that looked nothing like humans, tentacled creatures with too many eyes, serpentine beings that hissed under their breath, and giants made entirely of rock. One such being, a towering figure covered in thick, leathery scales, shot him a curious glance, his dark eyes narrowing. Eli didn't flinch. He had grown used to the stares. "Do you think they'll even let you finish the first round?" A low voice growled from behind him. Eli turned to find Atron, a fierce warrior from the Zephyrin race, his silver skin shimmering under the lights. Atron was famous for his speed. His species could move faster than any living being in the galaxy, and he was already looking down on Eli, confident that the human had no chance of competing. "Maybe," Eli said evenly. "I guess we'll see." The alien sneered and walked away, clearly unimpressed. Eli felt the familiar bite of skepticism, but this time, it didn't bother him. He had faced worse. This was just another challenge, another obstacle. He knew he wasn't the strongest, but that didn't mean he had no chance. The arena doors swung open, and the roar of the crowd surged forward, loud and insistent. Eli stepped onto the arena floor, and the weight of 1,000 eyes pressed down on him. His heart raced, but his breath remained steady. Zara's voice echoed in his mind. "You've done the hardest part already." He could feel the sweat beading on his forehead, but it didn't slow his movements. He wasn't here to be intimidated. He was here to prove that humans belonged. The first event was a physical endurance test, where competitors had to race across a track filled with obstacles designed to test every aspect of their physical and mental limits. Atron was in the next lane over, looking supremely confident. Eli knew it was his first real test, but while the others prepared for sheer speed and strength, Eli had one advantage: his mind. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. The voice of the announcer echoed across the arena. "The Galactic Games begin!" Eli sprang into motion, his legs pumping with precision. The obstacles ahead, walls that rose like mountains, narrow platforms over an abyss, would challenge his endurance, but he was ready. As the alien competitors raced ahead with blinding speed, Eli calculated every move, his mind sharp and focused. The game wasn't about being the fastest. It was about using the environment, using his body to its fullest potential. He leapt over a wall, using a calculated twist of his body to land just beyond it. His competitors were already ahead, but they were tiring. He saw it in their movements, their labored breathing, the slight dip in their stride. Eli stayed steady, his pace measured, as his endurance came to the forefront. His body screamed, but his mind stayed calm, making every movement count. Eli cleared the final obstacle, a vertical wall too high for most, and dashed toward the finish line. A wave of energy rushed through him as the crowd's roar filled his ears. He was about to cross the finish line when the Zephyrin, Atron, collapsed from exhaustion just meters away. Eli crossed the finish line first. The crowd was silent for a heartbeat before erupting in confusion. The underdog, the human, had done the impossible. Eli stood, chest heaving, sweat dripping down his face. He didn't have to say anything. His victory spoke for itself. Zara's voice crackled over his communicator. "Well done, Eli. You just proved that Earth doesn't back down." Eli smiled faintly, knowing this was just the beginning. He wasn't here to be a joke. He was here to change the galaxy's mind. The first round of the Galactic Games was over, and the arena still hummed with energy, a buzzing vibrato that thrummed through Eli's chest. The cheers of the alien crowd echoed like a distant storm in the cavernous expanse. He had done it. Outpaced the fastest, outlasted the strongest, but now came the hardest part: staying in the race. Eli stood at the edge of the course, chest heaving, his limbs aching in protest. His body, while not as naturally gifted as many of the other participants, had carried him farther than anyone had expected. His eyes swept over the finish line, past the alien competitors who were still recovering from the brutal endurance test. Their stares were filled with disbelief, a mixture of respect and confusion that mirrored his own internal battle. The underdog had made it through, but that wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. As he caught his breath, Zara Kellen approached from behind, her steady steps cutting through the arena's din. "You did well," she said, her voice low but filled with quiet pride. She was no stranger to pressure, but even she had felt the tension of watching Eli compete on this scale. "You've shown them that you're here to stay." Eli wiped the sweat from his brow, his fingers still trembling. "Barely," he muttered, shaking his head. He could still hear Atron's voice, the Zephyrin's taunting sneer before the race began. "The human will tire before we even reach the halfway mark." It echoed in Eli's mind, each word pushing him forward, a reminder of the skepticism he still had to fight. "You showed them more than endurance. You showed them strategy." Zara's voice was unwavering. "And that's what you've got over them. Don't let them bully you into thinking you're not enough." Eli glanced at his competitors, each species representing a different facet of strength. The towering Roken, whose 3 massive arms could crush stone with ease, the swift Zephyrins, and the Karnas, whose telepathic abilities let them anticipate moves with eerie precision. They had been expecting a human to fumble, to rely on brute force or speed, but Eli had surprised them all. His success wasn't just about strength or endurance, it was about his ability to outthink them. "I'm not here to just survive," Eli muttered, mostly to himself. "I'm here to win." Zara's expression softened as she met his gaze. "You're on the right path." The buzz of the crowd began to swell as the next challenge was announced. The announcer's voice echoed across the arena, a booming, synthesized sound that reverberated through the stadium walls. "Competitors, prepare for the next round of the Galactic Games, the Gauntlet of Shadows." The words sent a ripple of tension through the contestants. Eli's stomach tightened. The Gauntlet of Shadows was a grueling obstacle course that tested both physical and mental limits, an event notorious for its unpredictable hazards and terrifying speed. It was designed to weed out those who relied solely on strength and speed. This time, the games weren't about crossing the finish line first. They were about surviving the course's ever-changing dangers, a true test of mental endurance. Zara leaned in. "This one's all about mental agility. Your physicality will only take you so far. You need to think your way through it, Eli." He nodded, determination hardening his expression. He knew she was right. The other competitors would push through the obstacles with their natural advantages, but if he could keep his focus, his mind sharp, he had a chance to outlast them again. The arena shifted, the floor before him transforming into a chaotic landscape of moving platforms, shifting walls, and hanging obstacles. The air grew heavy, filled with the scent of ozone and something electric. The ground vibrated as the challenge began, its intensity palpable. Eli took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders as he stepped forward, entering the gauntlet. The noise of the crowd faded behind him, his entire focus honed on the course ahead. His pulse quickened, but his mind remained calm, calculating. The first challenge was a rapid climb up a towering wall that seemed to stretch into the sky. The Roken shot forward, his massive arms finding purchase as he scaled the wall with ease, but Eli didn't try to match him. Instead, he took a step back, looking for the outcroppings in the rock, the subtle crevices where he could place his hands and feet without overextending himself. It was about precision, not speed. He began to ascend, his body moving with methodical purpose. The sharp scrape of his boots against the jagged surface sent a jolt of discomfort through his spine, but he focused. Each movement was deliberate, calculated. The Zephyrins were already at the top, zipping ahead, their speed unparalleled. But as Eli reached the top, the next challenge revealed itself. Massive swinging pendulums that cut through the air in unpredictable arcs. His heart pounded as the pendulums swayed above him, their sharp edges glistening in the artificial sunlight. The Zephyrins were already weaving through the obstacles with ease, but Eli saw something they didn't. Each pendulum had a pattern, a rhythm to it. He watched the movements for a moment, timing his next move carefully. Then, with a burst of precision, he darted forward, dodging the pendulums with calculated grace. The next obstacle was a series of moving platforms suspended over a deep pit. The platforms shifted, rising and falling with unpredictable timing. Most competitors charged forward, relying on brute force to make the jumps. But Eli observed the platforms carefully. He noticed the subtle fluctuations in their speed and positioning, small discrepancies that others might miss. With his keen sense of timing, he leapt at the exact moment the platforms aligned, landing on each one with perfect precision. By the time Eli reached the final section, a high-speed sprint through a tunnel filled with traps, he had pulled ahead. His competitors were still fighting their way through the previous obstacles, their physical advantages no match for Eli's calculated approach. The tension in his muscles was a dull ache, but his mind was sharp, focused on each movement. As Eli reached the finish line, the crowd roared in disbelief. He had done it, outsmarted, outlasted, and outpaced the competition. The Zephyrins and the Roken were still behind, struggling to navigate the traps. Eli's chest heaved as he crossed the line. his mind still whirring with the strategy that had brought him here. He turned to see the Karnas, the telepathic aliens, staring at him with growing suspicion. Their faces, alien and cold, betrayed nothing, but their minds were clearly racing. They hadn't expected this. No one had. Eli had used the most human of qualities, his ability to adapt, his willpower, and his intelligence. And now it was clear. This was more than a physical test. It was a test of what it truly meant to be human. Zara appeared beside him, her eyes wide with admiration. "I told you they wouldn't expect this. You're making them rethink everything." Eli wiped the sweat from his forehead, offering a faint, satisfied smile. "Just getting started." As the announcer's voice echoed over the loudspeakers, calling the competitors to the next round, Eli stood tall. The games had only just begun, but Eli knew one thing for certain. Humanity wasn't here to just participate. They were here to win. The crowd's noise seemed to fade as Eli stood before the next challenge. The gauntlet of shadows had tested his body, but the next round was different, a battle of the mind. He could already feel the weight of it pressing down on him. As he stepped into the designated area, the cool air of the arena shifted, thick with tension and the metallic scent of the technology that buzzed around him. The floor beneath his feet hummed with energy, sending vibrations through his boots. The sound of alien voices faded, replaced by a low hum that made his skin prickle. This wasn't a physical test. This was a test of willpower, of endurance of the mind, something no one had expected from a human. The announcer's voice echoed through the arena, amplified and slightly distorted by the advanced alien technology. Round 3, the Mind's Challenge. You will face the Karnas, species known for their telepathic abilities. Prepare to face your greatest fears. Eli's breath caught in his throat. The Karnas. Their species was famous for breaking minds. They didn't need to overpower their opponents physically. They could manipulate thoughts, create illusions, and twist reality itself. Eli had read about them in preparation, but reading wasn't the same as facing them head-on. The walls of the arena shifted, darkening, and the air grew cooler. A sharp scent filled the space, like burning incense mixed with the sharpness of ozone. He could feel it in the air, the sense that this challenge would be more than just a game. This would be a battle for control of his mind. Eli clenched his fists, grounding himself in the here and now. He couldn't afford to let fear take hold. Ahead of him, 2 Karnas stepped forward. Their alien forms were sleek and fluid, their skin dark with patches of iridescent scales that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Their eyes were large, black and unblinking, and there was something unnerving about the stillness with which they moved. One of the Karnas, the elder of the 2, stepped forward and raised a hand. His voice came in a slow, melodic tone, laced with power. "Human, do you understand the challenge? We will enter your mind, probe your memories, your fears. Will you succumb to the illusions, or will you stand firm? This will be your true test." Eli nodded, his voice steady despite the storm of questions brewing in his mind. "I understand." The Karnas exchanged a glance, and then, without warning, the world around him seemed to bend. The arena dissolved like smoke, the walls fading into a vast emptiness. He was no longer standing on solid ground, but floating in an endless void, the air thick and suffocating. He couldn't see anything, no walls, no sky, just darkness. A distant sound echoed, soft at first, like the faintest whisper on the wind. Eli's heart pounded as the whisper grew louder, closer. It was his mother's voice, clear and sharp, calling out his name in distress. The weight of her voice brought a flood of memories back. He saw himself as a child, running down a street toward her. Then, the image twisted. The street was no longer his childhood home, but a dark alley, the walls closing in, his mother's face now twisted in fear, her mouth silently screaming. The illusion hit him like a physical blow, his heart racing in panic. He staggered, trying to breathe, but the air felt too thick, too dense. The whisper became a scream in his ears, echoing with all the pain of his past, the tragedy of his injury that had ended his career, the doubts that had haunted him for years, the fears that he wasn't enough, that he was just pretending to be the man he once was, flooded his mind. "Don't give in," Eli muttered to himself, his voice shaking but determined. He had faced worse than this. He had faced his own demons, fought them, and survived. He wasn't going to let the Karnas win. Not like this. The darkness around him shimmered, and in the blink of an eye, it changed. He was no longer alone. A figure emerged from the shadows, his former coach Miles Grayson, the man who had pushed him to his limits before the accident that had ruined his career. Miles' face was hard, unyielding, and his eyes bored into Eli with disappointment. "You're nothing without me," the illusion of Miles said, his voice a mocking echo. "You'll never make it. You were always weak. That's why you failed." The words sliced through Eli like a blade, cutting deeper than any physical injury. The memories of his failure, of how his body had betrayed him on the track, came rushing back. Eli felt himself falter, the weight of the past sinking him deeper into the darkness. But then he remembered the first victory. He had crossed the finish line, against all odds, and he had done it alone. The ghost of Miles's voice was just that, a ghost. He shook his head, his mind pushing back against the illusion. "You don't control me anymore," Eli whispered, more to himself than to the vision of Miles. He focused on his breathing, slow and steady, pushing the memories aside. Suddenly the darkness receded, and the illusion of Miles faded. Eli was back in the arena, the Karnas standing before him, watching him closely. The world was silent, except for the hum of the arena's machinery, and the only sound was Eli's breathing, steady and controlled. "You've passed the test," the elder Karnas said, his voice still calm but tinged with a note of respect. "Not many survive the mental trial, let alone resist the illusions." Eli exhaled deeply, his hands shaking slightly as he wiped the sweat from his brow. His mind was clear now. The fog of doubt lifted. The pain of the past no longer weighed him down. He had faced the darkness, faced his own fears, and come out on the other side stronger. Zara's voice crackled over his earpiece. "You did it, Eli. You're moving on." Eli didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood there, catching his breath, his mind still racing. The Karnas had tried to break him, but they hadn't succeeded. He was still standing. As the arena shifted back into place, the crowd erupted in applause. It wasn't just for his victory, but for the human who had withstood the hardest test of all. Eli's heart beat in his chest, but it wasn't with fear anymore. It was with anticipation. The games were far from over, but Eli had learned something crucial today. Victory wasn't just about physical strength. It was about resilience, mental toughness, and the ability to withstand what others couldn't even imagine. The next round would be harder. Eli knew it. But for the first time in his life, he felt ready. Eli stood in the quiet aftermath of the mental trial, his heart still pounding from the toll of the Karnas' illusions. His body ached, his muscles heavy from the strain of the games, but the fog in his mind had cleared. The challenge was far from over. He knew that now more than ever. As the arena shifted, the familiar buzz of the crowd in the background became a dull hum, distant yet present. The games had taken a toll on him, but he was still in the fight, and this next round, this next test, would push him beyond what he thought possible. The announcer's voice boomed, a sudden, sharp intrusion into his thoughts. "Competitors, prepare for the final test, the Gauntlet of Endurance. This event will determine the true champion. Only the strongest will survive. Only the most adaptable will triumph." Eli's breath caught in his throat. The Gauntlet of Endurance was a legendary trial, feared by all who had competed in the Galactic Games. It was a brutal combination of physical obstacles and environmental hazards, each designed to push competitors to their limits, both mentally and physically. The previous events had been difficult, but this was something else entirely. This was the true test. The ground beneath Eli's feet trembled as the gauntlet came to life. The arena before him transformed. Steel barriers rose from the floor, platforms shifted, and a maze of obstacles materialized, each more intimidating than the last. The air grew thick with the scent of burning metal and ozone as the environment began to change. His eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. There were walls that shot up from the ground, climbing vines with sharp thorns that could impale anyone foolish enough to touch them, fire-breathing drones weaving in and out of the paths. It was a nightmare designed to break even the strongest of wills. Eli's chest rose and fell with each breath, his senses heightened as the reality of the situation settled in. The crowd's cheers felt like distant thunder as the massive gates behind him slammed shut, trapping him inside. There was no going back now, only forward. His first instinct was to rush in, to tackle the course head-on, but Eli knew better than to give in to impulsive action. He had come this far by being strategic, by thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. This wasn't a race against time. This was a test of his will, his resilience, and his adaptability. He needed a plan. He needed to use every advantage he had left, his intelligence, his endurance, and the lessons learned from the trials before. His mind raced as he surveyed the arena. The first obstacle, a wall rising nearly 20 feet into the air, looked straightforward. But Eli knew from experience that nothing in the games was ever as simple as it seemed. The surface was slick, covered in some kind of alien moss that would make climbing it nearly impossible without the right approach. The solution came to him in an instant. He would use the vine-covered walls to his advantage. It would be a slower method, but it was more reliable. He would climb cautiously, making sure his every move counted. The sound of the starting horn pierced the air, and the other competitors took off like rockets, charging toward the first obstacle. Eli watched them for a moment, their speed and brute strength impressive, but he didn't flinch. He had learned from the earlier rounds that speed alone wouldn't win this contest. He could feel the pressure mounting, but his mind stayed sharp, calculating every move, weighing each step. The first wall loomed before him, and as the other competitors tried to scale it directly, slipping and sliding on the slick surface, Eli approached the vine-covered side. He reached out, his fingers brushing the thick tendrils, and tested their strength. The vines were tough, but they were also flexible. He gripped them with determination, feeling the rough texture of their alien surface under his fingers. Carefully, he began his climb, each movement slow but deliberate. His muscles burned, his breath coming in shallow gasps, but his mind stayed calm, calculating. The vines creaked beneath his weight, but they held firm, supporting him as he climbed. As he reached the top, he glanced back at the other competitors, who were still struggling with the wall. Eli's heart raced, but he didn't allow himself to get distracted. The next part of the gauntlet was already upon him, a series of fire-breathing drones that would trigger with the slightest movement. He knew they would react to any sound, any shift in the air, but he had also learned from earlier rounds that patience would get him further than speed. He crouched low, moving with calculated stealth, feeling the heat of the drone's blasts rip through the air above him, the smell of singed metal and burning fuel sharp in his nostrils. Each step was careful, deliberate, as he navigated through the maze of drones, never allowing himself to make a sound. As he neared the next obstacle, a thick mist began to seep into the arena. It wasn't just any fog, it was dense, thick, and disorienting, designed to throw competitors off track. The mist made it hard to see anything more than a few feet in front of him, but Eli didn't panic. His breathing slowed, his senses tuned to everything around him. He could feel the temperature shift, the slight chill in the air, and the dampness that settled on his skin. There was a slight shift in the ground beneath his feet, and Eli knew the floor was about to give way. He leapt forward, his legs pushing off with all the strength he had left, just in time to clear the collapsing section of the floor. His heart pounded, but his mind stayed sharp, calculating. He had predicted the trap before it even triggered. With every step, Eli's body screamed in protest, but he pushed forward, his resolve unshaken. As the mist began to clear, he saw the final obstacle, a massive chasm, at least 30 feet wide, with no visible way to cross. The other competitors were already there, trying to leap across, their massive forms barely making it halfway before they fell into the abyss below. Eli knew the physical leap wasn't possible, not for him, not for anyone, but there was always another way. His eyes flicked to the sides, scanning the chasm. There, just within reach, were metal beams crisscrossing above the gap. Eli had no time to waste. The others were too busy trying to leap, too caught up in their own pride. Eli's plan was simple. He would use the beams, carefully climbing across them to reach the other side. It wouldn't be flashy, but it was sure. Eli's hands grasped the first beam, the cold metal biting into his palms as he swung his legs up to join them. The beams creaked beneath his weight, but they held. His mind focused solely on the task ahead. He moved with precision, his body aching, his muscles screaming, but his mind was calm, steady. As he crossed the final beam, the other competitors were still struggling, the sound of their frustrations reaching his ears. Eli didn't stop to look back. He didn't need to. He had already won. The final challenge had not been about speed or strength. It had been about willpower, about taking each challenge one step at a time, outthinking the obstacles in front of him. When he finally reached the finish line, the cheers of the crowd were deafening. He had made it. Earth had made it. Zara's voice crackled over his communicator. "You did it, Eli. You're through to the final round." He stood there for a moment, panting, his body drenched in sweat, his heart still racing. He wasn't just the underdog anymore. He was the champion. And the galaxy had just learned that Earth had more to offer than they ever thought possible. The roar of the crowd reverberated through Eli's bones, echoing in his ears long after the arena had gone silent. His body ached, every muscle screaming in protest, but the weight of the final obstacle he had just conquered was heavy on his chest. He stood there at the finish line, chest heaving with the deep, steady breaths of a man who had pushed himself beyond his limits, physically, mentally, and emotionally. For a brief moment, all he could hear was his own pulse, thudding in his ears like a distant drum, the thrum of adrenaline still surging through his veins. Behind him, the towering forms of the other competitors, defeated and silent, lingered in the shadows of the arena. The Zephyrins, who had been so sure of their victory, their confidence shattered now. The Rokan, who had crushed every other competitor in their path, stood still, unable to fathom how a human had outlasted them all. And then there was Zorath, the final challenge, the one whom Eli had outwitted not by overpowering but by outlasting, by staying calm under pressure, by playing the game with a strategist's mind. Zorath's eyes, once filled with arrogance and scorn, now glimmered with something new: respect. Eli took a step forward, his feet heavy, but every part of him instinctively moving toward the platform where the trophy would soon be placed. The announcer's voice broke the silence, sounding like it was coming from a distance, the words blurred as if carried by the wind. Human champion Eli Jansen, victorious in the Galactic Games, the first human to ever claim victory in the history of the Games. For a moment the words felt surreal. He had done it, but not just for himself, for humanity. His victory had shattered centuries of alien superiority, the belief that humans were insignificant, that they were nothing more than a curiosity among the stars. The cheers of the crowd, the ones who had once jeered, laughed, underestimated, now felt like a triumph, a massive collective roar that echoed from all corners of the galaxy. Zara's voice crackled through his communicator, steady and filled with pride. "You did it, Eli. You showed them. Earth showed them." His throat tightened. He hadn't just done it for Earth, though. He had done it for every person who had ever been told they weren't enough, who had been told their dreams were too big, their ambition too foolish. Eli had shown them all that the true strength of humanity wasn't just in what was visible in size or speed. It was in the mind, in the will, in the ability to adapt, to learn, to persevere, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. And that was what the galaxy had overlooked. The crowd continued to cheer, but Eli's mind was still racing. He couldn't stop now. The games were over, but the war for humanity's place in the galaxy was just beginning. He could feel the weight of it, pressing down on him like an unseen force. This victory, while monumental, wasn't just about the games. It was about setting the stage for what came next. As the final ceremony began, Eli was ushered onto the podium, his legs trembling beneath him, his body tired, but standing tall. The trophy was handed to him, golden, heavy, the weight of it far more than the metal it was made of. It symbolized something more: hope, potential, and the idea that humanity could rise, could stand alongside these vast, powerful species, and prove that they, too, had a place in the universe. His fingers curled around the base of the trophy, the cool metal grounding him in the moment. Zara stood nearby, a proud smile tugging at her lips. "You've just rewritten history," she said quietly, as though it were still sinking in for her too. Eli's gaze flickered to the distant stands where the alien spectators had once jeered, now silenced in awe. Their faces, alien and strange, were filled with newfound respect. Among them, the Karnas, the telepathic species that had tried to break his mind, now watched him with open acknowledgement. The Zephyrins, the fastest beings in the galaxy, had no words for him, only expressions of reluctant admiration. Eli's victory had shaken them, but it was a change they hadn't expected. The humans had won, not by being the strongest or fastest, but by outlasting them with sheer perseverance and cunning. The victory felt surreal. But in that moment, standing tall with the weight of the golden trophy in his hands, Eli realized the true victory wasn't just winning. It was the ripple effect this would have on Earth, on humanity. The victory would echo through the stars, and it would change the way the galaxy viewed humans. But it was also just the beginning. There was more to come. The games were over, but the real battle had only started. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Zara asked, her voice low, but there was an edge of determination to it. She knew as well as Eli did that the victory would change things, not just for them, but for the entire galaxy. The politics of the universe were shifting, and while humans had proven themselves as formidable competitors, their place among the stars was not yet secured. Eli glanced at the galaxy around him, a universe that had for so long dismissed humanity. His victory today had shaken the foundations of that belief. But the battle wasn't just about the games. The true struggle was yet to come. He could feel it, an undercurrent of tension, of distrust. Some alien factions might never accept the fact that a human had outperformed them all, had bested their strongest. There would be those who would try to silence humanity's rising influence, to undermine Earth's newfound position in the galaxy. "We've just begun," Eli replied quietly, his voice a mixture of resolve and certainty. "This is just the start." Zara nodded, understanding the weight of his words. She stepped back, giving him space. The crowd's roar still reverberated through his mind, but Eli knew that his victory would only matter if humanity used this moment to move forward, to keep fighting, to build relationships, to prove that they were more than a single champion. As the ceremony drew to a close and the celebrations continued, Eli walked off the podium, the weight of the trophy heavy in his hand, but his eyes were fixed on the stars beyond. He wasn't just carrying a trophy. He was carrying the hopes of Earth, the promise of a future where humanity could thrive, where they would no longer be seen as insignificant. The games had been just one battle, but Eli knew that the real war was just beginning. And in the face of whatever came next, Earth's champion would be ready to lead them forward, to prove once and for all that humanity was not just a species to be looked at with curiosity or disdain. They were a species to be reckoned with. The universe had underestimated them, and Eli had shown them exactly what it meant to be human.